Hi, down, mateys. I am Jacaro Toro, and on this channel I talk about Australian Aborigines, their languages, cultures, history, and so on. And this is the second video about tribal names, the names of Australian Aboriginal tribes and what they mean. I started to look at that in the first video, and this presentation is based on Tyndale, 1974, where he discusses this quite a lot. So he divides tribal names into groups based on meaning. We looked at a few of these groups in the previous video, and here are the remaining ones. So let's start from the top, shall we? So he discusses names based on ecological or geographical differences. Here we need to note, however, that a number of the examples he gives are problematic for different reasons. Norman Tyndale was not a linguist. First and foremost, he was an anthropologist. Here are, however, a couple of Tyndale's examples that seem non-problematic. So, hill people from the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, and river people, Paganji, from the Darling River. The Darling River, which has its sources in northern New South Wales, and which has a confluence with the Murray River in southern New South Wales. Murray River, the Murray River, which meets the ocean south of Adelaide in South Australia. So Paga is literally the name for the river. Yes. I also have a few other examples here that I found that are not in Tyndale. In Tyndale's book, these pertain to the Kaurna tribe, which was called the Adelaide tribe by early settlers. It was divided into different groups, and the different groups had different names. And here are a few of these names. So, Northmen, Forest Men, and Murray River Men. And I believe that this is the name for the Murray River in the Kaurna language, just as this then is the name for the Darling River in the local language of these people. Yes. And speaking of Northmen, all these categories sort of tie in with each other here in this video. Speaking of Northmen, compass directions in tribal names, those are not generally true names, as Tyndale says. Compass directions in tribal names are most frequently found in names applied to groups by neighbors. Those are not names that the people groups in question have used for themselves. One exception seems to be this one, Northmen. So Norman Tyndale mentions, for example, the term Wilo, used in the Perth area by Nyungar or Noongar speaking tribes. for northerners. Wailo means northerner. And these were believed, these northerners, to be evil and to possess magical powers. This is something that many Aboriginal groups, by the way, have believed about other groups that they haven't met regularly, that they had supernatural powers of different types. Yes. However, when it comes to compass directions in tribal names, we must note that there is the tribe Yulparija in the Pilbara region of Western Australia these days. It is called Yulparija, which literally means southerners or southerner. And this is comprised of descendants of a few different groups that moved out of the Western Desert because of drought. According to Norman Tyndale, these three groups, Nangajara, Kugaja, and when it comes to Kugaja, for some reason it's unclear to me why he calls the Eastern Kugaja, Kugaja. The Western Kugaja he calls Wanga Junga, where Wanga is speech or language, and Junga is straight or correct. So, correct speech. Why does he call the Western Kugaja Wanga Junga? I'm not sure. Tyndale published his book in 1974, and since around that time, since the 1970s, this term Wankajunga has received another meaning. It was started to be used in another sense in the 1970s, in fact. I will come back to that when I talk about Madawanga, literally human language or speech. Yes. But now we are already talking about this category where we have a term that means language and or speech as part of the tribal name, which, according to Tyndale, shows the importance of language as a tribal differentiator. Perhaps not so much today, but certainly in pre-colonial Australia and earlier during the colonial time. I already mentioned Ngarawanga in the previous video. Ngarawanga, spoken somewhere around here in Western Australia. Now, languages that include, no, not languages, tribal names, of course, that include the word Wanga are spread out over quite a large area. But before we come to these languages, I would like to mention this part of Australia, the Cape York Peninsula, and the area immediately south of the peninsula. Here, tribal names generally start with Gogo or Wig, both meaning language. So language and then a name comes after that. Probably the most famous language in this area is Gogo Yimitir, from which we get the word kangaroo. But anyway, there are a great number of tribal names here that start with Gogo, which has received different spellings in literature. There is also a smaller group of languages, still tribal names, of course, that start with Wig, which also means language. So when it comes to these tribal names, Wangangoro and Wangamala are probably extinct by now. Both spoken originally in the Simpson Desert, Wangangoro in the south of the Simpson Desert and Wangamala in the east. Wangata is a language from the Eastern Goldfields region of Western Australia. And Madawanga, human speech, last but not least, is a Western Desert dialect that developed over the course of the 20th century, so it's a new dialect. It developed when speakers of four different original Western Desert dialects, as I understand it, were moved or moved freely to permanent settlements. Their dialects started to mingle, of course, and the result was Madawanga. Madawanga is these days also, and has since the 1970s, also been called Wangajunga. Wangajunga in different spellings. This Western Desert dialect is spoken in a number of communities in the northernmost part of the Western Desert, so at Fitzroy Crossing, which is all the way up here, at Christmas Creek, and at Jigalong. It has over 1,000 speakers, but as I understand it, young people don't speak it anymore. They understand it, but they reply to their elders in other languages, English or Creole, Northern Australian Creole. But the Western Desert language has a number of big dialects with many speakers, so it's certainly not a threatened language as a whole. Jigalong, by the way. The Jigalong community was the home of Molly and Daisy Craig, two girls who walked 1,600 kilometers, almost exactly 1,000 miles, along the rabbit-proof fence. They walked home along the rabbit-proof fence, as seen in the Australian movie Rabbit-Proof Fence from 2002. A really good movie, by the way. You should see it if you haven't. I saw it in Australia when it came out. Anyway, tribal names with names based on ecological or geographical differences. We have seen a couple of names based on compass directions. Well, one was for a sub-tribe, a group within a tribe, and tribal names that include a term for language and or speech. This will be all for today, but I will be back. So, see you later.